Okay, it's time to get started. Thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium, Session 323, Real War in the Book of Mormon, the Gadianton Robbers of Ancient Rome. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There is more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. Today's presentation, the Book of Mormon events involving Gadianton Robbers bear striking resemblances to conflicts in ancient Rome described by historians Sallust and Tacitus. Sallust recounts an unsuccessful coup attempt similar to events in the Book of Helaman, while Tacitus tells of a war in North Africa resembling events in 3rd Nephi. Similarities include essential characteristics of the people involved, such as motives and government operations, military objectives and tactics, both on the battlefield and in diplomatic efforts, and the close timing of parallel events. Mormon even resembles Roman historians in biographical experiences, moralizing tone, and use of Roman historical conventions. Jared Manning received bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering from BYU and currently works as a professional engineer in Utah. As a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and longtime wrestling coach, he teaches grappling to men, women, and children, including several active MMA fighters. I'll now give the floor to our presenters.
Okay, thank you for that, and good morning. Welcome from Tooele, Utah. All right, here. Okay, I'm just trying to advance my slide here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to start off with a quote here from Hugh Nibley. War is anything but glamorous in the Book of Mormon. The campaigns and battles are described not as a writer of fiction would depict ancient warfare with all its excitement and color, all that a romantically inclined young American of the 1820s would imagine as the gaudy trappings of heroic daring do is conspicuously missing. It is real war that we see here. A tedious, sordid, plotting, joyless routine of seesaw successes and losses, brutally expensive, destructive, exhausting, and boring, with constant marches and countermarches that end sometimes in fiasco and sometimes in intensely unpleasant engagements. Warfare in the Book of Mormon has been addressed by various scholars and commentators who have reached the same basic conclusion as Hugh Nibley. It is real war that we see here. This combined study and commentary is part of a larger apologetic argument whose purpose is to show that the Book of Mormon is what it says it is, an actual account of ancient historical peoples. One aspect of warfare in particular, the conflicts with the Gadianton Robbers, has received a significant amount of attention. In keeping with Book of Mormon prophecy that foretells modern-day secret combinations, recent commentators have compared them to communist revolutionaries, terrorists, organized crime realms, and drug gangs. Cyberspace abounds with comparisons to a wide variety of contemporary political figures and socio-political organizations. Ezra Taft Benson, as apostle and later as president of the church, has been perhaps the most notable voice promoting Gadianton robber comparisons. Throughout the Cold War, he repeatedly compared them to a worldwide communist conspiracy in a series of books and talks. Before I go any further, I should first confess to having engaged in exactly this type of political thinking and discourse from time to time, mostly in my younger years. In fact, researching and coming to understand the groups I perceived as modern Gadianton robbers was the primary reason I came to accept the Book of Mormon as divine scripture. These enigmatic evildoers can look a lot like real people to someone with an avid interest in history and politics, and the repeated warnings from Book of Mormon prophets, not to mention the modern day ones, can look a lot like inspired foresight. One thing about the Gadianton robbers has puzzled me over the years, though. Why does the Book of Mormon primarily refer to them as robbers? Of all the words that could have been chosen, robber seems the least apropos. They start out as conspirators that assassinate the chief judges in order to take the reins of government. Later, they wage guerrilla warfare on a devastating scale and are implicated by Mormon in the destruction of his own people. They did do their share of plundering, of course, but Mormon is intent on telling us just how wicked and dangerous these secret oath-taking, slave-trading city destroyers are. So why does he equate the epitome of evil with mere common criminals? Winston Churchill, in recounting the Second World War, certainly didn't refer to Hitler and the Third Reich as mere robbers, even though they plundered many of the treasures of Europe. The meaning of robber has changed a little bit since the Book of Mormon was produced. It was associated with brigands or bandits then, more so than it is today. This is a sense that is a closer match to the Gadianton robbers than our modern conception. But bandits and brigands don't seek to take the reins of government, nor are they able to field vast armies capable of challenging a powerful nation state. The word robber seems strangely out of place in its context in the Book of Mormon. It turns out that if we look to classical Latin, we can find the perfect word for Book of Mormon robbers, latro. Plural is latrones. This word was used in antiquity in certain contexts by Roman politicians and historians in the same way robber is used in the Book of Mormon. But what does Latin, or ancient Rome for that matter, have to do with the Book of Mormon? The purpose of this paper is not to add one more item to a long list of people or socio-political groups that resemble the Gadianton robbers. Instead, I aim to show that the entire concept of the Gadianton robbers, as presented in the Book of Mormon, is based on historical sources from the ancient Roman world. Gadianton robbers don't just happen to resemble ancient latrones. I believe they are best explained as being literarily dependent on classical sources, particularly the works of historians Sallust and Tacitus. Let's start with the meaning of the Latin word latro. As with many words, latro was used in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, and both are important to understand for this discussion. In its most literal sense, latro means bandit or brigand. Latro bands commonly contained people on the margins of society, such as escaped slaves or deserters, or people on the frontiers of the empire, such as mobile pastoralists, expert in harsh desert or mountainous terrain. They made their living, or at least subsidized their nomadic lifestyles, by robbing travelers, rustling cattle, or raiding villages. These were professional men of violence who often killed innocent people in pursuit of plunder. This is similar to the way robbers were sometimes thought of in the early 19th century. But these common bandits of antiquity were not seeking to take over the government, nor were they powerful enough to take on the mighty Roman army. Eventually, the word latro came to be used metaphorically as a pejorative against one's political enemies, since latrones were the lowest type of people imaginable in ancient Roman society. The cruelest forms of execution, such as crucifixion, being burned alive, or being fed to wild beasts, were usually reserved for latrones. Eventually, these forms of executions were used against Christians as well. To call someone a latro was to call them the worst thing possible. Modern political epithets, terrorist or fascist, are sometimes used in the same way. The first ancient known to have used the word latro in this way was Cicero against his political enemy Catiline. Later, the Emperor Tiberius uses the same slur against Tacfarinas, the leader of an army in northern Africa. Part 1, Catiline. Catiline is best known for two secret plots to overthrow the government, known as the First and Second Catilinarian conspiracies. Catiline was an ambitious politician from a noble family advancing through the ranks of the Cursus Honorum. For these conspiracies, he was accused of a variety of serious transgressions, unspeakable acts of illicit sex, to the murder of his wife and son, to extortion as governor of Africa. He was prosecuted several times but never convicted. Cicero, in his first oration against Catiline, accused him with these words, quote, "There has now for many years been no crime committed but by you. No atrocity has taken place without you. You alone, unpunished and unquestioned, have murdered the citizens, have harassed and plundered the allies. You alone have had power not only to neglect all laws and investigations, but to overthrow and break through them." In this speech, Cicero referred to Catiline and his band as Latrones Italiae, the robbers of Italy. Catiline's counterpart in the Book of Mormon is Gadianton, the namesake of the evil robber bands Mormon accuses of being responsible for the final overthrow of the Nephites. Gadianton was expert, quote, "in his craft to carry on the secret work of murder and of robbery. United with his band in order that, quote, they might murder and plunder and steal and commit whoredoms and all manner of wickedness." Gadianton and his band were responsible for several plots to take over the Nephite government. The First Catilinarian conspiracy. Ancient sources are mixed on whether Catiline was even involved in the first conspiracy. This plot came about in 66 BC after two consuls-elect, Petronius and Sulla, were disqualified from entering office the following year after being convicted for bribery. A second election was held, and the two men who had prosecuted the bribery convictions were elected. According to historian Suetonius, Petronius and Sulla conspired with Caesar and Crassus to murder a bunch of senators at the Senate at the beginning of the year. Crassus was to be set up as dictator with Caesar as second in command, and Petronius and Sulla were to be restored as consuls. The plan ultimately wasn't carried out when Crassus failed to arrive on the appointed day. In Sallust's version, only Petronius was involved in the conspiracy, and his main co-conspirator was Catiline, who had tried to run for consul that year but was rejected because of legal proceedings against him. Their plan was to kill the new consuls on the Capitol at the beginning of the year and seize power. When their plan was discovered, they altered it and decided to murder not only the consuls, but several senators the following month in front of the Senate House. The plan ultimately fell through. In the Book of Mormon, Helaman 1 describes events similar to the First Catilinarian conspiracy. Helaman 1 begins with a contention about who should have the judgment seat following the death of the chief judge. Three brothers, all sons of the deceased chief judge, vied for the position, and Pehorn was selected. As was Sallust's version of Roman events, one of the two unsuccessful candidates, Paanchi, then conspired to gain power for himself. And like the Roman conspirators, he was unsuccessful. This angered his followers, who conspired to send an assassin to murder Pehorn. Just as the Roman senators were to be killed at the Senate or the consuls on the Capitol, the chief judge was to be murdered as he sat on the judgment seat. Unlike the Roman version, though, the conspiracy was successful in killing Pehorn, though the conspirators were not able to seize power at that time. Gadianton isn't mentioned in Helaman 1, and like Catiline, it's not clear whether he was part of this first conspiracy. The Second Catilinarian conspiracy. In 64 BC, 2 years after the first conspiracy, Catiline ran for consul. His plan as consul was to initiate severe civil strife, giving him the pretext to murder the rich and seize their property through a process known as proscription. Secretly, he gathered support from several other senators and noblemen, promising them magistracies and priesthoods and a share of the spoils. He came up just short in the election, so the winners Cicero and Antonius took over as consuls in 63 BC. The loss only seemed to strengthen Catiline's resolve, and he continued to recruit conspirators and prepare caches of weapons at strategic locations around Italy. When he again failed to win the consulship in 63 BC, he hastened plans for civil war, sending co-conspirators to the Italian provinces to recruit an army. In Rome, he prepared mobs of armed men to riot and burn parts of the city. Catiline knew the watchful consul Cicero would be a barrier to his plans, so he sent assassins to his home to get him out of the way. Helaman too begins along a similar track. Helaman had just been appointed by the voice of the people to be the new chief judge 2 years after the first conspiracy. Waiting in the shadows was the evil and ambitious Gadianton, the head of a conspiracy, seeking to put him in charge of the government. Gadianton promised his secret band of supporters they would be placed in positions of power and authority if they would help him obtain the judgment seat. Their stated purpose was, quote, to murder and to rob and to gain power. Gadianton sent an assassin to the judgment seat to kill Helaman. Both assassination attempts were thwarted. Cicero had discovered the plan from an informant, the mistress of one of the conspirators. Helaman had a servant that had infiltrated Gadianton's group and discovered the plan. Helaman's servant killed the would-be assassin, and Gadianton and his men fled from the city into the wilderness. The corresponding Roman events played out a little differently, though with some notable similarities. Cicero had posted guards to ward off the would-be assassins. The next day, he came before the Senate and accused Catiline of plotting against him. In this famous speech, quoted from earlier, Cicero laid out the conspiracy against him and demanded Catiline leave the city. Catiline, who was present for the speech, fled Rome in the dead of night with a few of his men to meet up with supporters, forming an army to the north. Both of these stories end the same. Decisive military victories extinguished both the Gadianton robbers and Catiline's army of Latrones. But before we get to the end, there are some other interesting similarities in the stories that need to be fleshed out. One of the notable aspects of Gadianton robbers is their secret oaths. Mormon tells us these secret covenants exist in every generation of robbers, but he doesn't give us many details, presumably because he doesn't want to provide an instruction manual. Catiline's conspiracy was also reported to have been bound by a secret oath. Sallust reports a rumor that the inner circle of conspirators each sealed their oath in a secret meeting by consuming wine mixed with blood from a human body handed around in bowls. Later ancient historians reported the conspirators' oaths included human sacrifice and cannibalism. Gadianton's co-conspirator Kishkumen was killed on his way to assassinate Helaman. The servant who intercepted him and pretended to lead him to the judgment seat did not try to prevent Helaman's assassination another way. Perhaps he could have sounded the alarm to palace guards or stalled Kishkumen in some way in order to rally help from others. Though we can't be certain, it seems possible Kishkumen could have been detained and brought to trial as Payankai had in the previous chapter. Instead, the servant took drastic action he apparently felt was prudent and killed the assassin by stabbing him on his way to the judgment seat. The subtext of this story indicates Mormon likely felt the servant's actions were morally justifiable. Catiline had 5 co-conspirators, 5 Kishkumens, if you will, that were intercepted by Cicero's men and executed just a few days later. Cicero had obtained solid evidence of the conspiracy, so he brought the conspirators along with the evidence to the Senate, where they ultimately confessed. The Senate debated the fate of the men and voted to execute them. Out of fear the conspirators would be rescued by armed mobs rallying in their support, Cicero had the 5 men executed that night without a legal trial. Cicero would later be severely criticized for executing Roman citizens without a trial, and went into exile for a time to avoid political enemies looking to punish him for it. Sallust, who was no fan of Cicero, doesn't seem to criticize him for this choice. If anything, he seems to be letting us know through the Senate speech of Cato, who Sallust admired, that Cicero's actions were morally justifiable. As mentioned earlier, both conspiracies came to decisive ends. In Catiline's case, though, the end was rather anticlimactic. He had managed to raise a substantial army, but lost many to desertion following the execution of his comrades. In the end, outnumbered, he faced off in a pitched battle against a consular Roman army. In early 62 BC, Catiline and his army were destroyed, down to the last man, according to Sallust. The Book of Helaman provides us with a much more dramatic ending. The Nephites didn't immediately raise an army to confront the Gadianton robbers. In fact, they searched for them in the wilderness but couldn't find them. For years, the Gadianton robbers built up strength and even seized the government at times. Finally, about 30 years after Gadianton and his men fled into the wilderness, the Gadianton robbers commenced a war with the Nephites. The war became so devastating that Nephi pleaded with the Lord to replace the war with a famine so the people would repent and not be destroyed by war. The plan worked, and we find out the Nephites swept away the Gadianton robbers so that they had, quote, become extinct. Sallust wrote about the Catilinarian conspiracy soon after Caesar's assassination, while the Republic was struggling for its last breaths. From his perspective, in the late 40s or early 30s BC, after decades of violent political upheaval, proscriptions, civil war, and assassinations, things in the once glorious Roman Republic had gone terribly wrong. Sallust's explanation for the problems of his time was the internal moral rot of its citizens. Avarice, sexual immorality, cruelty, and the love of power ushered in Rome's decline, and Catiline was its archetypal figure. Just as Catiline represented all that was wrong with Roman society, Gadianton is a symbol of Nephite corruption and decline. Gadianton and his followers indulged in practically all the evils of the declining Roman Republic described by Sallust. In 3rd Nephi, the Nephite government of judges was destroyed after over 80 years of being infested with Gadianton robbers and their supporters. During that time, the people declined in morality as the robbers grew strong, engaging in Romanesque debauchery and murder. When the people repented, they were able to defeat the robbers. The end came suddenly in 3rd Nephi chapter 6 and 7, when the wicked once again united in a covenant to take control of the government. The once united Nephites separated into tribes, their system of government having been destroyed. Like Sallust's portrayal of Catiline, Gadianton represents evil that leads to political violence, assassinations, war, and ultimately the destruction of Republican government. Before I move on from my comparison of Catiline the Latro to Gadianton the robber, I should point out what may be the most remarkable similarity of all, their names. Catiline is an Anglicization of the Latin Catilina. Catilina and Gadianton are both four-syllable words with similarities in each syllable. First syllable, cat and gad, have the same vowel sound and the same mouth position for both the leading and ending consonants, cat, gad. Second syllable, both names have the letter I, which makes slightly different sounds, I versus E, Catilina, Gadianton. Third syllable, stressed in both names, both end with the consonant N, Catalina, Gadianton. Fourth syllable, both have the short U sound, Catalina, Gadianton. Okay, this is a summary slide that just reviews side by side the similarities between the corresponding events from Catiline's War and the Book of Mormon. First off, we've got Catalina, Gadianton. Right, we just talked about the similarities in those names. Contemporaries referred to Catiline and his followers as Latrones, where Mormon referred to Gadianton and his followers as robbers. We talked about why those names mean the same thing. Catiline or Catalina was the archetype of Roman society's ills, leading to violence and breakdown of Republican government. Gadianton was the archetype of Nephi society's ills, leading to violence and breakdown of Republican government. Conveniently, the first Catilinarian conspiracy corresponds with Helaman 1. We'll see that the second Catilinarian conspiracy corresponds with Helaman 2. But they begin in similar time frames, 66 BC and Helaman 1 about 52 BC. The first conspiracy of Catiline was formed by Atronius. Remember, he had wanted to be consul. He had actually been elected, but then disqualified. In Helaman, it was been formed by Paanchi. Remember, he had wanted to be chief judge, but his brother was chosen over him. Atronius wanted to set himself and others over the government. Paanchi wanted to make himself the chief judge. Both plans were ultimately unsuccessful. The Catilinarian plan was to kill the new consuls on the Capitol or the senators at the Senate House. In Helaman 1, they killed the chief judge on the judgment seat. And the historical sources are mixed on whether Catiline was really involved. And if you look carefully at the story in the Book of Mormon, it's not clear whether Gadianton was involved. He's not specifically mentioned, but it's possible to read it as if he had been part of that first conspiracy. Okay, we go to the second Catilinarian conspiracy. It began 2 years after the first, and Helaman 2 also begins 2 years after Helaman 1. So we have that same 2-year separation. Catiline desired to murder others to obtain their wealth. That's exactly what the conspirators, Gadianton and others, were trying to do in Helaman 2. Catiline promised his supporters magistracies and priesthoods in order to get support. Gadianton promised power and authority to his followers. So you see the same type of technique being used. Catiline tried to murder the consul. Gadianton's band tried to murder the chief judge. Both assassination attempts were ordered, one by an informant in the conspiracy, another by a spy in the conspiracy. Catiline soon fled the city with other conspiracy members after the failed assassination attempt. Gadianton also soon fled the city with other conspiracy members after the failed assassination attempt. The co-conspirators in the Catilinarian conspiracy were killed, arguably extra-legally, but this action is presented as morally justifiable. We get the same sort of argument here with Kishkumen, who was killed by the servant, arguably extra-legally, but this action is also presented as morally justifiable. The Catilinarian conspiracy was rumored to have used secret oaths to bind the conspiracy. You saw the drawing. That was a 17th century drawing depiction of the second Catilinarian conspiracy. And we know that Gadianton did use secret oaths to bind his conspiracy. At the end, both conspiracies waged civil war, one against Rome, the other against the Nephites. And according to Sallust, the entire army was killed, down to the last man in the Catilinarian conspiracy. Helaman 11, which depicts the events of that last war, indicates that the conspirators became extinct. So they were apparently killed down to the last man as well. At least that's one way of reading that. Okay, part 2, Tacfarinas. The Latro Tacfarinas began vexing the Romans early in the 1st century AD. Roman historian Tacitus provides the details in his Annals of Imperial Rome. Tacfarinas was a native tribesman of North Africa who had deserted from the Roman army, where he had served as an auxiliary. His first followers, this is a quote, were vagabonds and marauders who came for loot. Then he organized them into army units and formations, and was finally recognized as the chief no longer of an undisciplined gang, but of the Musulmanian people, a powerful nomad tribe on the edge of the African desert. He was considered a latro, partly because he engaged in guerrilla warfare, which the Romans called latrocinium. Key to understanding the conflicts with Tacfarinas, as related by Tacitus, is Sallust's monograph, The Girthine War. Sallust had served as governor of Africa and was familiar with the geography, terrain, and the native peoples. Modern historiographers have noted similarities between Tacitus's account and Sallust's monograph, even going so far as saying that Tacitus imitates Sallust by describing the war in terms of the Jugurthine War. The Jugurthine War had occurred about 130 years earlier, but many of Sallust's details about tactics and terrain help us better understand the nature of the conflict with Tacfarinas. In part 1, I compared the Catilinarian conspiracies to events in the Book of Mormon found in Helaman chapters 1, 2, and the first part of chapter 11. In part 2, I make a comparison to the war with Tacfarinas by looking at the last part of Helaman 11 and chapters 1 through 6 of 3rd Nephi. Helaman 11 is a transitional chapter with the Gadianton Robbers. First formed, they were Nephite insiders looking to obtain the reins of government. They were eventually successful in taking over the government, but were ultimately extinguished in the first part of the chapter. Later in Helaman 11, they formed again. This new incarnation of Gadianton robbers lived in the mountains and roamed the countryside, killing and plundering. These are the robbers that resemble Tacfarinas and his men. Okay. Combatants. 3 main groups were involved in the ancient Roman conflict. The Romans and Tacfarinas' armies were the primary combatants, but the North African kingdom of Mauritania eventually became involved as well. The Mauritanians were ruled by their own king, but were a client state of the Roman Empire. In the final year of the conflict, the Romans found themselves outnumbered and called on King Ptolemy of Mauritania for help. His armies were instrumental in the final victory over Tacfarinas. The king was awarded by the Romans for his assistance. Quote, "Then, in recognition of the loyal conduct of King Ptolemy of Mauritania during the hostilities, an ancient compliment was revived, and a senator dispatched to award him an ivory scepter, an embroidered triumphal robe, and greet him as king, ally, and friend." The Book of Mormon events similarly have 3 main groups involved in the conflicts. The Nephites fought against the Gadianton robbers and were aided by the Lamanites, people with whom they normally had an adversarial relationship. The faithful Lamanites were rewarded for their assistance. Quote, "And their curse was taken from them, and their skin became white like unto the Nephites, and their young men and their daughters became exceedingly fair, and they were numbered among the Nephites, and were called Nephites." These and other similarities are summarized in the following table. So we've got the Romans and the corresponding Nephites. Romans were Europeans. Nephites had white skin. Romans were an agricultural-based economy with walled cities, as were the Nephites. The Roman government contained Republican elements, as the Nephite government did. And the conflict against Tacfarinas is related from the point of view of a Roman historian, Tacitus. The Book of Mormon events are related from the point of view of a Nephite historian, Mormon. So we've got Tacfarinas' armies, who were latrones, and then we've got the Gadianton robber armies, who were robbers in the Book of Mormon. Tacfarinas lived in the mountains and deserts. Gadianton lived in the mountains and wildernesses. Tacfarinas' armies were composed of Roman deserters and Mauritanians, so people from the 2 other groups. Gadianton robbers similarly included Nephite dissenters and Lamanites, so people from the other 2 Book of Mormon groups. Tacfarinas' armies were pastoralist tribesmen. We never quite get a clear understanding of what type of lifestyle the Gadianton robber armies had as far as how they made their living besides plunder. But it's notable that they wore lambskins into battle. Perhaps that means that they were pastoralists as well. Okay, the Mauritanians, they were African natives. Corresponding Book of Mormon peoples are the Lamanites, who had, quote, skin of blackness. Mauritanians were a kingdom. Lamanites were a kingdom. The Mauritanians were client state of Rome. Client state of Rome's weren't always in conflict with Rome, but at times they did rebel. In this case, though, they actually helped the Romans. Lamanites, of course, we know are normally adversarial to the Nephites, and so this was a rare time for them to join with the Nephites in fighting the Gadianton robbers. Let's see, we talked about the allies there. Because of his assistance, the Mauritanian king was honorably referred to as ally and friend of the Roman people. Look at the Lamanites who had assisted the Nephites, numbered among the Nephites and called Nephites. Mauritanian king was awarded a triumphal robe and ivory scepter. Lamanites became exceedingly fair and skin became white. I can't help but think that there's a metaphorical similarity there between the rewards of the Mauritanian king and the Lamanite peoples. Okay, let's go on and talk about tactics. Tacfarinas and his followers came onto the scene, committing nomad raids and destroying villages and looting extensively. The first major confrontation between Tacfarinas and the Roman commander coaxed the Latrones into a conventional battle and routed them with a smaller army. After that, Tacfarinas conducted a guerrilla campaign, giving away under pressure and then attacking from the rear. The natives' mastery of the terrain allowed them to descend from their hiding places in the hills and the wilderness, where they could quickly retreat to avoid retaliation from the slower conventional Roman forces. Sallust relates that the Romans tried in vain to attack a Numidian fortress in the desert. Because of the fortress's natural protection, being in an isolated area on the edge of a mountain precipice, protected by a muddy swamp in the winter, the Romans, masters of siege warfare, were unsuccessful. The Book of Mormon describes Gadianton robber tactics very similar to Tacfarinas' armies. From Helaman 11:25, quote, "And they did commit murder and plunder, and then they would retreat back into the mountains and into the wilderness and secret places, hiding themselves that they could not be discovered." From 3 Nephi 1:27, quote, "Save it were for the Gadianton robbers who dwelt upon the mountains, who did infest the land, for so strong were their holds and their secret places that the people could not overpower them." From 3 Nephi 2:11, "For the Gadianton robbers had become so numerous and did slay so many of the people and did lay waste so many cities and did spread so much death and carnage throughout the land." And from 3 Nephi 4:1, "Those armies of robbers had prepared for battle and began to come down and to sally forth from the hills and out of the mountains and the wilderness and their strongholds and their secret places." In addition to guerrilla tactics, the Latrones tried their hands at siege warfare. In their first attempt, they had some success in a conventional battle when Romans refused to stay hidden behind their walls. The next attempt at siege warfare against the Romans did not fare as well for Tacfarinas' army. The Romans defeated them with a much smaller army by again choosing to attack the besiegers on the open battlefield. After this defeat, the Numidians stuck to guerrilla tactics. The Gadianton robbers also tried their hands at siege warfare against the Nephites. And like the Romans, the Nephites didn't simply wait behind their fortifications. Instead, they marched out and met their enemies in a series of battles in the open field. In this manner, they were able to inflict massive losses upon the Gadianton robbers. Eventually, the Gadianton robbers gave up the siege when their own provisions ran too low. Okay, here's a side-by-side comparison of tactics with the Latrones and the Gadianton robbers. They both killed civilians. They were indiscriminate. Latrones burned and destroyed villages. Gadianton robbers, great destruction, laid waste many cities. The Latrones committed raids and looted extensively. The Gadianton robbers plundered and robbed extensively. They both waged guerrilla warfare from their mountain, desert, or mountain forest hiding places. The Latrones had limited success at siege warfare. The Gadianton Robbers were completely unsuccessful at siege warfare. The Latrones retreated to the desert, while the Gadianton Robbers retreated to the wilderness and mountains. We come to the Romans versus the Nephites and look at their tactics. Both were victorious in the initial battle and were superior in conventional battles. They both countered their besiegers with direct attacks, and just as the Romans were unable to defeat a Numidian mountain fortress, we see that the Nephites could not overpower the Gadianton Robbers from their mountain strongholds. Okay, we'll move on here to attempted diplomacy. Gadianton, the leader of the Gadianton Robbers, sent Liconius, chief judge and governor of the Nephites, a bold letter. The plight of Gadianton's men, as related by his letter, provides an interesting contrast to the picture painted by Mormon. Mormon portrays the robbers in solely negative terms. They were dissenters who murdered and plundered, took women and children captive, and destroyed cities. They were evil conspirators whose purpose was to enrich themselves on the labors of others. Gadianton, on his part, related that his people had been repeatedly wronged by the Nephites and accused the Nephites of denying his people their rights of government. Gadianton offered to cease hostilities with Liconius. The Nephites could become their brethren and partners of their substance if they would take an oath of peace. The conditions were that the Nephites give up their cities, lands, and possessions without the shedding of blood. The alternative, wrote Gadianton, was nothing less than a war of extinction. Liconius was, quote, exceedingly astonished by this correspondence because of its boldness and lies. Mormon tells us that Liconius was a just man and could not be frightened by a robber. Gadianton was the head of a fearsome army, but he was hardly a king or head of state of a legitimate nation. Perhaps Liconius did not consider it just, according to his understanding of the rules of warfare, to deal on even terms with a mere robber. Tacitus relates a similar incident in which Tacfarinas attempted to negotiate peace with the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Quote, Tacfarinas was insolent enough to send representatives to Tiberius demanding land for himself and his army. As the alternative, he offered endless war. No personal or national slur, it is said, ever provoked the emperor more than the sight of this deserter and bandit behaving like a hostile sovereign. Even Spartacus, reflected Tiberius, burning Italy unavenged, at a time when he had destroyed consuls' armies and the nation was convulsed by terrible wars overseas against Quintus Sertorius and Mithridates VI of Pontus, had not been allowed conditions for his surrender. And now, with Roman power at its height, was this Latro Tacfarinas to be bought off by a treaty granting lands? Although a treaty granting lands seemed preposterous to the emperor, it would have been logical to the native North African pastoralists in Tacfarinas' army. It may be that their traditional grazing lands were being encroached upon or controlled by the Romans. It's natural they would attempt to reclaim access to these lands. Here's a side-by-side on the attempts at diplomacy between Tacfarinas and Gadianton. Tacfarinas, of course, was the Latro leader, Gadianton, the Gadianton robber leader. Neither of them attempted to negotiate with the provincial governor or the local commander. Instead, they went straight to the top. Tacfarino to the emperor in Rome and Gadianton to the chief judge and governor in Zarahemla. Tacfarinas offered peace in exchange for land. Gadianton offered peace in exchange for Nephite cities, lands, and possessions. Tacfarinas threatened endless war if his offer was refused. Gadianton threatened utter destruction and extinction if his offer was refused. Tacfarinas claimed to be fighting a war of liberation. He urged his soldiery, quote, all who preferred freedom to slavery to make a united effort to drive out the Romans. Gadianton, on his part, claimed that the Nephites had usurped his people's rights and government, and that they were making war to reclaim these rights. Tiberius, the Roman emperor, responded. He was angry and insulted that a mere Latra was trying to negotiate with him, as if a hostile sovereign. Iconius, the Nephite chief judge, was exceedingly astonished, and could not be frightened by the demands and threatenings of the robber. Okay, we'll go on here to the final victory. The Romans became frustrated at being unable to confront the armies of Tacfarinas in a pitched battle. Finally, after receiving intelligence about the location of Tacfarinas, the Romans dispatched fast-moving troops in the darkened night. At dawn, they attacked. Quote, the enemy were taken unawares. They had no weapons, order, or plans, and were dragged to death or captivity like sheep. The Romans sought out Tacfarinas in the conflict and were able to surround him and his guards. Tacfarinas escaped captivity by rushing the Roman armies, suffering mortal wounds at the points of their weapons. The Romans won a decisive victory, slaughtering or taking prisoner many Lectrones. The Nephites used a similar ploy to defeat the Gadianton robbers. Gadianton knew ahead of time where the enemies were marching and sent out Nephite armies in the nighttime to surround them. In the morning, when the Gadianton robbers began their march, they were met on every side by the Nephite armies. This prevented the Gadianton robbers from retreating into the wilderness as they were accustomed to doing under direct attack from the Nephites. The Nephites were able to capture the leader, Zemnariah, who did not receive an honorable warrior's death like Tacfarinas. Instead, he was executed by hanging. The decisively defeated Gadianton robbers were all slain or taken captive. Here's a slide, side-by-side comparison. Tacitus, or Tacfarinas in the Annals of Tacitus indicates that intelligence had revealed Tacfarinas' location. I guess I should mean that it was revealed to the Romans. In the Book of Mormon, they had foreknowledge of the Gadianton robber movements. They both did a secret night march, the Romans and the Nephites. A dawn raid on the part of the Romans, a morning surprise attack. Those are essentially the same thing. They killed the enemy leader on both accounts, and both of them had decisive victories, resulting in massive enemy casualties and prisoners. Okay, 7 years of war. The Gadianton robbers began to make war from their hiding places in the mountains about 12 years before the birth of Christ. Continuing conflicts are mentioned in the 11th year before Christ's birth, and then again in the 1st, 2nd, and 13th through 15th years. In the 16th year, Iconius received Gadianton's letter. Iconius sent out a proclamation, and by the end of the 17th year, the Nephites had gathered together in one place with 7 years of provisions. This was the beginning of their final stand against the Gadianton robbers. In the 18th year, the Gadianton robbers began to take possession of the vacated Nephite lands, and battle commenced in the 19th year. Depending on which event is considered the starting point, this final war began sometime between the 17th and 19th year after Christ's birth. There were several conflicts with North African tribesmen in the years leading up to the war with Tacfarinas. The war with Tacfarinas lasted about 7 years, from 17 AD to 24 AD. This is practically identical to the time period of the Nephite last stand. It's difficult to say with certainty, though, in which year the fighting against the Gadianton robbers ended. The Lamanites began their siege in the 21st year. After the final Nephite victory, they preached the word to the captured Gadianton robbers and either punished them or released them into society, depending on whether they were truly repentant. At that point, Mormon tells us they had put an end to the Gadianton robbers, and then immediately says that the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th years had passed away. In the 26th year, the people returned to their lands. It's possible the fighting ended in any of the years between the 21st and 25th, depending on how long it took to preach to the captured Gadianton robbers and sort out those that needed punishment. The fact they still had provisions remaining as they headed home in the 26th year gives us a hint to how long this business with the prisoners may have taken. The Nephites managed to last a little longer than 8 years with only 7 years of provisions while still having some left over. Since they would have also had to feed, quote, many thousands of prisoners, it's likely they weren't kept for long. It seems likely the end of the fighting came in the 25th year and the prisoners were dealt with quickly that same year. In showing the near identical dating of these events, I remind the reader that the actual year of Christ's birth is unknown, though most commentators have given dates between 7 BC and 1 BC, with modern scholarship indicating it likely occurred in 4 BC or earlier. Classical understanding based on Luke 3, however, puts Christ's birth in 3 or 2 BC. Using a birth date of 2 BC and putting the beginning of the war in the 18th year, when the Gadianton Robbers began to sally forth from the mountains, these two 7-year conflicts have the exact same starting and ending years. So here's a summary of the 7 years war. In both cases, there were sporadic hostilities that led up to the final 7-year conflict. On the left, these dates are AD dates. We know the dates from the Roman historians. And they begin in 17 AD between Tacfrinus and the Romans. As you look at the Book of Mormon events, these are dated for years after Christ's birth. Keep in mind that if you use a birth date of 2 BC, then that puts that 18th year to be identical to 17 AD. But it's hard to decide exactly when that 7-year conflict began, whether it was when they began to gather their provisions, when the Gadianton Robbers began to take their lands, or when the battle actually commenced between them. But we see in 24 AD, the Romans decisively defeat Tacfrinus' armies, killing him in the process and putting an end to native resistance in North America, or in Northern Africa. And we see that it was likely the 25th year after Christ, which would correspond to 24 AD with the 2 BC birth. The Nephites decisively defeat the Gadianton Robbers, killing their leader in the process, and put an end to secret combinations. All right. Part 3. This is a short part. Other Romanisms in the Book of Mormon. It's easy to see similarities between Mormon and several Roman historians. Besides being a historian, Mormon was a general and a prophet. An obvious Roman counterpart is Julius Caesar, one of the great generals of world history. He was also chief priest of the Roman state religion and an important historian in his own right. His election to Pontifex Maximus, a lifetime appointment, occurred in the same year as the Second Catilinarian conspiracy. Sallust and Tacitus also fit this mold somewhat as statesmen historians who held religious positions or military commands, but on a smaller scale than Caesar. In understanding the Book of Mormon, Grant Hardy discusses several embedded documents in the Book of Mormon. Among these, he lists 8 letters and as many as 17 speeches. Sallust and Tacitus both commonly presented letters and speeches in their respective histories as well. One particular letter in Sallust's histories bears a striking resemblance to Moroni's letter to Pahoran in Alma chapter 60. Pompey was fighting a war in Spain, and in 75 BC sent a letter to the Senate excoriating them for their lack of financial support for the war effort. Quote, "You have done your best to destroy me by hunger, the most wretched death of all. Was it with this expectation that the Roman people sent its children to war? Are these the prizes for wounds and for blood spilled so often on account of the Commonwealth?" End quote. He threatened to return to Rome with his army. Quote, "If you do not come to our aid, my reluctant prediction is that the army, and with it the whole war in Spain, will transfer to Italy." Captain Moroni also wrote an angry and fiercely critical letter to the government during a brutal campaign. He directed it to the chief judge and to, quote, "all those who have been chosen by this people to govern and manage the affairs of this war." Like Pompey, he complained bitterly of hunger and other afflictions and accused the government of neglecting the war effort. And also, like Pompey, he threatened to bring his army back to the seat of government if they did not send help. Moroni sent his letter in about 62 BC. So here's side-by-side summary you saw from the last page, how similarly they dressed, or at least how it's similarly they supposedly dressed, at least according to Arnold Freeberg's conception there. So the histories of Sallust, that Pompey's letter written by a Roman general. Book of Mormon, we have Moroni's letter written by a chief captain. Pompey's letter was sent to Rome from the field in the Roman province of Hispania. Moroni's letter is sent to Zarahemla from the field in outlying Nephite lands. Pompey's letter was directed to the Senate. Moroni's to the chief judge and other government officials in charge of managing the war. They both had a very angry and critical tone, and the contents were very similar. They both complained of hunger, lack of soldiers, and other hardships. They both accused the government of neglecting the war effort, and they both threatened to bring the fight back home if help wasn't provided. We once again see a close dating here with Pompey's letter sent in 75 BC and Moroni's in 62 BC. Okay, conclusion. It has been popular among some scholars and many Book of Mormon critics to see everything in the Book of Mormon as a reflection of Joseph Smith's environment. From the point of view of the apologists, on the other hand, there seem to be abundant connections to the ancient Near East and ancient American civilizations, particularly those from Mesoamerica. It seems that both sides are determined to see what they want to see. So what are we to make of the Romanisms in the Book of Mormon? In my opinion, they are too numerous, too specific, and too clustered to dismiss as mere coincidences. Sallust and Tacitus could have conceivably been available to Joseph Smith, but are we to believe he read these classical sources and weaved parts of them into a story of his own creation? Or that in the translation process, he unconsciously or otherwise expanded on the underlying Nephite text with stories from classical history? It seems more likely that someone else more knowledgeable and capable than Joseph is responsible for the Romanisms in the Book of Mormon. But who? Recent scholarship indicates that the original language of the Book of Mormon is largely consistent with early modern English from about the 1530s to the 1730s. Building on this early modern theme, Royal Skousen lists 10 issues within the Book of Mormon that Protestants were dealing with in the 16th and 17th centuries. These apparent early modern connections to the Book of Mormon are puzzling. Potential ancient Roman connection is no less puzzling. Consider for a moment, though, that Latin was the lingua franca of early modern Europe and that the study of ancient Roman literature and history was an integral part of education in European universities. Sallust was the most popular ancient historian throughout early modern times, with Catiline's War being the most published work. Tacitus's popularity was not as consistent throughout the entire period. During the last quarter of the 16th century, as religious and civil wars plagued Europe, the Tacitist approach to history gained popularity as a way of viewing events. Tacitus became the most prominent ancient historian of the 17th century. Several early modern historians, particularly from the Netherlands, imitated the Tacitan style in their histories. Perhaps the Romanisms in the Book of Mormon are additional evidence supporting the idea that the Book of Mormon is in some way connected to the early modern world. Okay, I can see we're just about out of time for questions, but let me...
We have one question, Jared, if that I think you have time to answer, and that's, will you be publishing an article on these findings? This is a very interesting presentation.
I may be publishing an article if I could find someone to publish it, I guess. but yeah, I would like to.
I'm sure that won't be a problem. This has been a great presentation. And unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions because we had such a fabulous presentation with a lot of information. But you guys can continue in the Hoover community chat rooms, the Q&A rooms, keep talking about this. And I'm sure that Jared would love to answer your questions. There's some great questions, but you have to answer them offline. But
Yep, I'd be happy to do that offline. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
See you for the next session, guys.
All right, bye-bye.